I'll introduce myself. My name is LB Nye, and I am the manager of the regional program section with the Los Angeles Water Board. And you've met Kenny, Dr. Kangxi Wang, who is the lead staff on the Los Cerritos channel, bacteria TMDL, and works on a lot of bacteria issues for us. And our purpose here today is to address the statewide bacteria provisions developed per the US EPA 2012 recreational criteria, and discuss why the reference system approach wasn't used in the Los Cerritos Channel and Estuary, Alamitos Bay, and Colorado Lagoon bacteria TMDL. The full name of that TMDL is Los Cerritos Channel and Estuary, Alamitos Bay, and Colorado Lagoon. For the most part today, I'll probably just say the Los Cerritos Channel bacteria TMDL, because that's a lot of words. But most of all, we're here today so that we could get your input on our bacteria approaches in the Los Angeles region and what our priorities are for ought to be for bacteria going forward. And Kenny, you can give me the next slide.
LB, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Did you still see your?
I still see the text. It's not the end of the world, but if you can figure out how to, I'll keep going. But if you can figure out how to just have the slideshow, that'd be great. So our discussion today will focus on, well, first, the goal of the workshop is to hear from all of you. But first, I'd like to review a little bit of the history of bacteria objectives and bacteria TMDLs here in the Los Angeles region. And then maybe review a couple of the stakeholder comments and issues of concern shared at the public hearing when the Los Angeles Water Board adopted the Los Cerritos Channel bacteria TMDL. That was in March of this year. And then I'll touch on some of the challenges and opportunities as we see them. And that should take me about 20 minutes. And then we can hear from you on these questions specifically, but also on other bacteria issues, what you think are the board priorities ought to be for bacteria issues, for example. So the next slide. So in March of this year, like I said, the Los Angeles Water Board adopted a bacteria TMDL for the Los Cerritos Channel and Estuary, Alamitos Bay, and Colorado Lagoon. And since with this TMDL, we used a different approach to setting the targets in comparison to all the bacteria TMDLs we had done previously, several stakeholders were concerned, and they wanted to know more about the new approach and if it could be used in more watersheds. So the board directed staff to hold a workshop and solicit input. So that's what we're doing here. This is the language on the slide is the language directly from the resolution from last March. The executive officer is directed to hold a public meeting to solicit additional input on the approach for implementing the statewide bacteria provisions through TMDLs in the region, and then to consider whether revisions to TMDL's approach are appropriate and to develop and present such recommendations if they are. We have the next slide. So, but before we get your input, I'd like to review a little bit of the history so we're all on the same page. Fecal indicating bacteria, or FIB sometimes.
Sorry.
Oh, it's working now. All right. But let's see, probably on slide 5. One more. That's it. Okay. So I think we're all very familiar with the fecal indicating bacteria. Coliforms, total coliforms, fecal coliforms, E. coli, and Enterococci. These have been used for a long time, more than a century, I think, to detect sewage contamination in water in order to protect the public from waterborne pathogens associated with fecal material. So the pathogenic viruses, protozoa, and pathogenic bacteria. In 2001, this board updated the bacteria objectives in our basin plan to be consistent with US EPA's recommended criteria, and that was the Ambient Water Quality Criteria for Bacteria in 1986 and the California Code of Regulation. These objectives included both single sample maximum objectives and geometric mean objectives. Then in 2002, the Los Angeles Water Board had added bacteria implementation provisions to our basin plan, specifically the provision which allowed a reference system anti-degradation approach. And at the same time in 2002, the board adopted the first bacteria TMDL, the Santa Monica Bay bacteria TMDL, which used that approach. So with that approach, the Santa Monica Bay bacteria TMDL and all of the bacteria TMDLs that followed up into this last one established an allowable frequency of exceedances of the single sample maximum objective, which established an allowable number of exceedance days of the single sample max, while also requiring attainment of the geometric mean objectives. So in 2010, the board updated the bacteria objectives for freshwater and basically just removed fecal coliform that's consistent with US EPA's recommendation that E. coli be used as the indicator in freshwater. And then in 2012, US EPA established new water quality criteria for bacteria using updated epidemiological studies and a specific public health goal of not more than 32 additional illnesses per 1,000 recreators. And then 2018, the State Water Board adopted new statewide bacteria objectives and implementation options. And these are the statewide bacteria provisions. And the objectives for bacteria were based on the US EPA 2012 recreational water quality criteria. And then in February of 2020, the Los Angeles Water Board amended our basin plan for bacteria objectives to align with the objectives in the State Water Board's bacteria provisions. So the amendment removed the 2001 to 2010 bacteria objectives. They're no longer applicable, and now we just have the statewide objectives. Go to the next slide. Can I have the next slide, Kenny? It should be a list. Whoop. It's a list. It's about to come of all of our bacteria TMDLs in the Los Angeles region. So the first bacteria TMDL, as I said, was the Santa Monica Bay Beaches bacteria TMDL. It was first adopted for dry weather in 2002, January 2002, and later on for wet weather in December of 2002. And then all of these other bacteria TMDLs, until the very last one, all have used the reference system anti-degradation approach. The bacteria TMDL for the Los Cerritos channel bacteria is the first one that we developed after the statewide bacteria provisions were in place. So the first one we have using the statewide bacteria provisions. Several of these TMDLs have been reconsidered and modified by the Los Angeles Water Board. For example, in 2012, this board adopted a reconsideration of 5 bacteria TMDLs, making adjustments, including the establishment of a 6-week rolling geometric mean. All the TMDLs require attainment of the geometric mean, but many of them still have the 30-day geometric mean, and then there are 5 that have 5 of these have a 6-week rolling geometric mean, which is what's in the statewide bacteria provisions in our basin plan now. So the Los Cerritos channel bacteria TMDL also has the 6-week rolling geometric mean. Can I have the next slide? So just a review of the reference system anti-degradation approach. This is based on a statistical analysis of the historical exceedance frequency of the single sample maximum observed in a reference system. So in Los Angeles, we have used Leo Carrillo Beach as the reference beach, and then a collection of reference freshwater data to act as the freshwater reference. The allowable number of exceedance days is based on the historical exceedance frequency in the reference system, multiplied by the number of dry and wet weather days in the 90th percentile year, in 90th percentile in terms of wet weather. That way, we have exceedance days allowed in wet weather and in dry weather. The number of exceedance days is based on 2 criteria. The first, I just explained, the water quality at the designated reference site, but also no degradation of existing water quality is allowed. So if the historical water quality at a particular site is better than the designated reference site, then that site has to continue to attain its historical good water quality. And there are a few beaches in Santa Monica Bay, which we call them anti-degradation beaches. They're the anti-degradation part of the reference system anti-degradation approach. However, it's worth noting this approach does not consider the link between illness rate and contamination in the water. So the target was not set to not exceed a certain illness rate. So can I have the next slide? So in 2012, EPA replaced the 86 bacteria criteria with a new bacteria criteria. They added to the epidemiological studies that they had conducted in the 70s and 80s with new epidemiological studies, including studies under the National Epidemiological and Environmental Assessment of Recreational Water, or NEAR studies. And they also expanded the definition of gastrointestinal illness. So it was not just limited to illnesses with a fever. So it's a slightly broader range of illnesses. And they specified acceptable illness rates. EPA established either a 32 illnesses per 1,000 recreators or 36 illnesses per 1,000 recreators. And California is implementing the 32 illnesses per 1,000 recreators. And then EPA continued to recommend using fecal indicating bacteria, specifically Enterococci and E. coli as indicators of fecal contamination in freshwater and Enterococci in marine water. EPA also computed an STV, or statistical value threshold, based on the water quality distribution observed during the epidemiological studies, the NEAR studies. And the STV approximates the 90th percentile of water quality distribution. And it's intended to be a value that should not be exceeded by more than 10% of the samples. And that's because the densities of fecal indicating bacteria are highly variable, as you know, and the distributional estimates like an STV are more robust than a single point estimate. And there are no more single sample maximum criteria. So EPA set these recommendations to be protective of public health, regardless of the source of fecal contamination. And by that, I mean, they don't take into account the source. That is, it is the source of the fecal contamination that you're measuring, you're assessing, is that from human or animal or other? That's not part of the criteria. However, EPA does discuss in their 2012 criteria the potential for developing site-specific standards for those states that are interested in adopting different standards to address that variability in human health risk associated with different sources of fecal contamination on a site-specific basis. Next slide. So the next two slides, I'm just going to show you quickly the current water quality criteria for fecal indicating bacteria. So these are the EPA recommendations to meet 32, not have more than 32 illnesses per 1,000 recreators. And this is what's in the state bacteria provisions criteria and what we have in our basin plan. This one here is specific for inland waters, freshwater lakes, rivers, streams, and estuaries and enclosed bays. And as you can see, the indicator parameter is E. coli for freshwaters and Enterococci for saline waters. And you also see the data are to be assessed two different ways. There's a 6-week rolling geometric mean and a statistical threshold value calculated over the period of a month. Next slide. And these are the objectives for the protection of water contact recreation in ocean waters. It includes our ocean beaches and open bays like Santa Monica Bay. So here we have Enterococci and fecal coliform as the pathogen and indicator types, both geometric mean and statistical threshold value. And there's also one single sample maximum. It was not removed by the state board in 2018. So just in marine waters and just for fecal coliform, there actually is still a single sample maximum. Next slide. So in March of this year, the Los Angeles Water Board adopted the Los Cerritos Channel and Estuary Almeidas Bay and Colorado Lagoon bacteria TMDL. So that was our first TMDL without the reference system anti-degradation approach. And there is no more single sample maximum criteria anymore, at least not in inland waters. And the reference system approach only applied to the single sample maximum objectives and never applied to the geomean. So there's no way to calculate allowed exceedance days without a single sample maximum. I will share with you, it was strange for Los Angeles Water Board staff to recommend a TMDL without some kind of reference approach. It felt weird, especially since our executive officer, as I think many of you know, Renee Purdy, she wrote that TMDL back in the day, the Santa Monica Bay bacteria TMDL. She basically invented the exceedance day approach. So it did feel a little strange to us, but we couldn't figure out any legit way to calculate exceedance days, allowable exceedance days, with the STV calculated over a month or mean calculated over 6 weeks. We have the next slide. So that really was a key question when the board adopted the Los Cerritos bacteria TMDL. Why is there no reference system anti-degradation approach? Both the Los Cerritos Channel Watershed Group and the County of Los Angeles and Los Angeles Flood Control Districts commented at that time that a reference system anti-degradation should be used to calculate allowable exceedances of the geomean and as of the STV numeric targets. And these stakeholders commented that we should retain the reference system approach because they suggested it was consistent with past TMDLs and because it is allowed by the statewide bacteria provisions. And the county also provided an allowable exceedance calculation with their comment letter, which per their calculation would allow for as many as 3 months of exceedance of the STV per year and 10 exceedances of the 6-week geomean. So reference approaches are allowed by the statewide bacteria provisions in our basin plan, but this would not be really consistent with past TMDLs because past TMDLs always applied the geomean directly and didn't allow any exceedance of the geomean. So in this way, the Los Cerritos Channel bacteria TMDL is consistent with past TMDLs. And there isn't an appropriate technical method to calculate days of exceedance with STVs or geomeans. Here's the thing, the duration of the allowed exceedance with the exceedance day approach is 1 day. Maybe there's several days, but the duration of the exceedance per exceedance is 1 day. With STVs, that's a month-long period of time that if there was an allowable exceedance, the beach or water body would be allowed to exceed for the entire month, and the geomean is 6 weeks long. So a very different duration. Also, the STV can be exceeded right now. The STV can be exceeded up to 10% of the time in a calendar month. So there's a built-in allowance for some exceedance. So applying a reference system approach to the STV, which already allows for a 10% exceedance rate, would result in an overall allowable exceedance rate that would be less protective than was intended by the reference system approach. And while the statewide bacteria provisions in our basin plan allow for the use of a reference system approach, they don't require it. So due to the differences in the expression of the STV objectives in the statewide bacteria provisions, as compared to the prior single sample maximum objectives used in previous TMDLs, the reference system approach wasn't used in the Los Cerritos Channel bacteria TMDL. Well, I think next slide. Another key comment at that time was demonstration of an illness rate as demonstration of compliance with the TMDL. The County of Los Angeles and Los Angeles County Flood Control District pointed out that an illness rate of 32 per 1,000 recreators, that was what was used by EPA to develop the 2012 water quality criteria and the state board for the statewide bacteria provisions. And in addition, the statewide bacteria provisions highlighted evolving science using potential for improved indicators in the future, including studies such as a quantified microbial risk assessment or QMRA to establish risk in the future. So the commenter suggested if MS4 permittees conduct a study which demonstrates that an illness rate of 32 per 1,000 water contact recreators or less could be achieved in the receiving water, then that should be sufficient to demonstrate compliance with the TMDL. And our response, it was sort of an agreement because we do agree that in the future, perhaps alternative indicators or methods or use of methods to demonstrate like a QMRA or an specific epidemiological study could be used to demonstrate that the human health risk that's established, the 32 additional illnesses per 1,000 recreators, that could be used to demonstrate that a beach or water body is meeting the criteria. But we also thought that to write that into a TMDL at this time would be premature because there isn't sufficient implementation detail to include that in a TMDL at this time. We really don't know by what method we would do that. I have the next slide. So site-specific criteria are possible, just like the County of Los Angeles and County Flood Control District commented. I mean, I know we all know that fecal indicating bacteria are shed in the feces of all warm-blooded animals, including birds, and the risk of swimmer illness associated with fecal indicating bacteria from human sources is greater than the fecal indicating bacteria associated with non-human sources. And the US EPA 2012 guidance and the statewide bacteria provisions and the basin plan all allow for this. There's no specific guidance or detailed methods or templates for setting site-specific water quality objectives. One potential method that gets discussed often is a quantitative microbial risk assessment, or QMRA. QMRA is a tool for estimating the human health risk from exposure to pathogens from different sources or via different routes. And if a QMRA would come up with a risk assessment, and it could be compared to the 32 illnesses per 1,000. And a QMRA would probably be much more economical and practical to, say, conducting an epidemiological study for a particular water body or beach. That would be a lot more expensive than a QMRA. We have started and then not completed a couple of QMRAs in this region. One for Hobie and Kitty Beach, which they started it, and then they found there was potentially a source from a leaky pipe nearby. So they stopped the QMRA to go and fix the pipe. That makes sense. And we started one in Cabrillo Beach and sort of lost momentum when we weren't sure how we were going to calculate the potential inputs from groundwater. We didn't know how we were going to pay for that study. And the other thing, I observed with the Inner Cabrillo Beach QMRA attempt was we were using the human indicator HF 183 as an indication of our other human sources, and we were finding it in pretty much every sample, at least even on so-called clean beaches on Outer Cabrillo Beach. There would be at least a little bit, just right at where we could measure it, but it was there. And I think we really weren't sure what to do with that information. Is there just sort of a urban area background of this marker? And that's all it means, is we're in an urban area? Or does that mean something? Like, should we be looking for the human sources that are, so we can control them, that are contributing to that marker? So there are really a number of outstanding questions in using QMRA in this for this purpose and in this manner. But I think it still has potential. And can I see the next slide? Also, standards can be changed. We changed them in 2001 and 2010 and 2018. Though the rulemaking process, including the technical work and outreach, is a really lengthy process. It takes several years after technical work is done. Can I have the next slide? So I don't know if many of you, I think some of you at least, went to the State Board's Bacteria Summit last week. 3 days of just discussion of site-specific objectives, revisions to objectives, potential innovative ways to implement TMDLs. These were all discussed very enthusiastically, but like I said, at this time, there's no specific guidance, no detailed methods or templates for any of this. So I think the most I can say at this time is I think there is momentum between the state board and the regional boards and many stakeholders about developing the science and the technical work, and then guidance and detailed methods or templates. So I think I put that under our opportunity column there. I think there really is some momentum with the State Water Board Bacteria Summit. And I think another thing I've observed, another opportunity, I think, is that there are a lot of stakeholders, including stakeholders right here in Los Angeles, who are doing innovative work and are asking some of these questions, and they're taking actions to control bacteria right here. And I think that's an opportunity. And, you know, the implementation provisions of the US EPA 2012 guidance and the statewide bacteria provisions and our basin plan all allow for, you know, reference approaches or natural source exclusions. So there's room there. There's an acknowledgement and room there to develop some of these kinds of tools that we're talking about. And in terms of the challenges, I really think our main challenge is we need to protect beaches and water bodies right now. And these last few minutes, all I've been talking about things we could do in the future. But we do have an obligation, a need to protect recreators who are in our waters right now, and not, you know, we can't just say, well, you know, we'll wait a few years and see what the science tells us. And the other challenge I think we have is just, you know, being able to take advantage of the latest science. So the objectives protect the beneficial uses. And, you know, that's finding the resources, finding the staff, not just for water boards, but for all of the stakeholders too. Just, you know, following up on these kinds, the new science, and creating even more new science and technical work is going to be a lot of time and effort from all of us. So the next slide. I think I'm up to the, yes. So that's my background on the Los Cerritos channel bacteria TMDL and why we don't use the reference speech approach anymore. So this is where we want to hear from all of you. Questions and comments on the approaches we're using or should be using, and also what you think the priorities of the Los Angeles Water Board should be in terms of bacteria or pathogen indicators. Maybe, you know, whether we should prioritize reconsidering bacteria TMDLs, for example, or new TMDLs. I think it'll work best if you keep your initial comments to a couple minutes, maybe at most 5 minutes, but we do have lots of time. So you'll likely, you know, have the opportunity to speak more than once if you have a lot to say, so you'll be able to say it. So I guess, Kenny, you can take over at this point and see who our first, who's going to give us our first feedback.
Yeah, if you have any comments, feedbacks, please raise your hand and I will follow by the sequence.
Oh, there's some hands up. They're good.
Hold on a second. Hi, let's talk.
Hi, this is Masto Churi, Assistant Director at LA Sanitation and Environment. LB, I was wondering if you guys have a fact sheet that concerns this. If you could have, you know, perhaps a table created that that in one column has the reference anti-degradation approach versus the statistical threshold value approach, and you know, the differences between the two. I think that would really help all the listeners and the regulated community on you know, what you're proposing. So, and perhaps even a list of kind of advantages and disadvantages of both would be very, very helpful.
Yeah, we can do that.
Great. Thanks, LB.
Yeah. Sure.
So we go to Jack Comer. You need to unmute. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. I think I only raised my hand earlier when there was issues with the Zoom, and I forgot to put that down. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Well, I'm glad you don't have issues anymore.
Healer.
Hello?
Hi,
Yes,
Heather.
I can hear you.
Hi, sorry, lowered my hand. Thank you, LB, for that presentation. And yes, I think those of us who attended the bacteria TMDL or bacteria summit gave us a lot of food for thought for how to maybe approach some of these challenges that you put in your presentation. I think that I'm Heather Miranda. I work for the city of Santa Clarita, and as the stormwater compliance administrator, and the Santa Clara River is a unique place in LA County. We have nearly 90% open space, so our natural sources and our reference condition can have an especially strong influence on our water quality in the river. And so it's really important that we have natural sources accounted for when addressing fecal indicator bacteria in the river. And it's more than 10% of the time during wet weather, sometimes during dry weather. And that's what our interest is in this particular TMDL, because it's, you talked about why, but it is abandoning 20 years of precedent to the reference system anti-degradation approach. And so while this TMDL affects one small watershed right now, I feel like the conclusion is kind of, there's some things that we need to wrestle with the STD objective and the basin plan. And it feels like, I guess I get concerned when I hear saying, well, when LA County put its, suggested formula forward, and you said, well, then that would mean that the beach, reference would be influencing all the time. And I guess I think that's the place where we have to wrestle with, right? It's like, if the reference reach is actually exceeding all the time, then there's something bigger here that we really have to address. And I appreciate your discussion of the QMRA and some of the other things, and how people have kind of we've stopped and started. In Kitty Beach, it sounded like they actually found human source of bacteria, which is great, right? Because that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to find the riskiest sources so that we can make sure that the water is safe to swim and people aren't getting sick. But it's the TMDL, by abandoning the reference system, it makes the TMDL targets unattainable. And we could be in a situation where we spend an enormous amount of money building all these infiltration facilities, and the receiving water is still in violation of the TMDL, which is a really bad place for any of us to be, right? Mm-hmm. And that's really concerning to me. And it has, there's obviously cost implications, but the bigger issue is that we have to be good stewards of all of our resources, environmental and financial, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm feeling like there's a lot of really technical questions and a lot of things that we heard, but I'm also seeing that the triennial review.
Yeah, that's coming up.
Yeah, and all of those things, a lot of these things are in the triennial review as a priority to study. Mm-hmm. And, perhaps it is a good idea to hit pause, right, on the idea that this is how we're going to do it moving forward, and really get some experts, really focus on the triennial review process, really look hard at this and try to find a way through so that areas like ours and a lot of places in Ventura County, and a lot of places in the upper watersheds that are strongly influenced by natural conditions, don't get unduly burdened with the exclusion of it, because there seems to be an assumption of 10%. And I'm not sure that, I don't think it doesn't seem like that's the right number, right?
Yeah.
I'm also concerned about, if we're I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the reference systems were kind of sampled a while ago for inland waters, and then that's just been kind of how our go-to. If I'm wrong about that, then please correct me, but that needs to be an ongoing and a much more dynamic process to quantify it, rather than having done it and creating kind of an index from many, many years ago and a one-off and saying it's never a problem going forward.
Yeah, I can say a couple things in response to you. You did highlight something which I probably should have highlighted, and it would go on Mass's, fact sheet with the differences between the two approaches, because and that's in the treatment of wet and dry weather, because the reference system, at least for the single sample maximum, it treated wet and dry weather differently. When you lose the single sample maximum, the reference approach, the geomean doesn't treat them differently. It's just, wet weather is just incorporated in with the dry weather. If you happen to sample on a wet weather day, that becomes part of your data for your geomean. So that is a difference between the two approaches. I would say, I don't think we're really abandoning the reference method, but all the TMDLs have always required attainment of the geomean. I think we just didn't focus on it very much. People were very focused on, well, I've got to meet this number of exceedance days. Maybe we just assumed that once you met your exceedance days, you'd be in pretty close to your geomean.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
in dry weather, I think that is a very different conversation than in wet weather, which is, we heard ad nauseum last week, right? It's a very different thing.
Yeah.
And those of us coming terms with wet weather and doing all our own investigations and doing our DNA analysis and trying to figure this out are really struggling, right? With, with how to move forward. And I think that taking a beat to look at it more comprehensively from a public health perspective, from from more experts, from an implementer, and from a stakeholder perspective, I think would serve us better in the long run, while we're still doing our source ID, while we're still doing our adaptive management, all those important things to make sure that we're trying to find the sources of problems and controlling what we can control. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a priority then, is to start looking at one of the first questions we look at is if we can treat wet weather differently than dry weather. I don't know how we would do that, but that could be a priority. And the other thing I wanted to respond to is you did say about the reference data used for the freshwater sections, and that was from a while ago. That was, I think, 2004, 2007, in that era. So we can certainly look at updating that too. Although if it's a reference site, it shouldn't be changing a whole lot.
Well, and that's the thing, we don't know, right? We don't know. I mean, there is climate change, there is bigger, development happens, and different animals populate, come and go. So it's actually a very dynamic system. It's not static, because it just really depends on a lot of factors that we don't quantify, and maybe that's somewhere where we can as permittees step up too and do more work in this area, because I think that's an important part of the equation.
Okay, thank you. Kenny?
Yes. Next one.
Yeah.
Go to Evelina.
Evelina.
Good morning. Do you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much, LB and Kenny, for putting together the workshop and sharing this information with us. I have a couple questions. I was wondering about the existing bacteria TMDLs. Do you have any intention or plans to revise to also align them with the statewide bacteria provisions? And number two, I'm glad to hear, last week efforts and discussions are being acknowledged, and it seems like we are getting more and more on the same page when it comes to the challenges with bacteria TMDL compliance. And so I was wondering if you have any intentions or what's your intentions, what's your plans to kind of come up with the strategy for the bacteria TMDL compliance, how it should look like, should there be any priorities? Because what we've heard last week was, and we've known about this for a long time now, there's so much unknowns about the limits. And so in order to responsibly, guide implementation efforts, mostly kind of related to funding, are there some priorities that we could possibly all agree on to make it in some type of phases, some type of strategy for keeping our waters clean, but also being considered in compliance?
Yeah, I think in terms of aligning all our existing TMDLs with the new objectives and the new approach, we don't have anything in our work plan right now to that. That could be a lot of work. I don't know that it doesn't bother me that we have TMDLs that all have slightly different approaches. I mean, some have 5-week, month-long 30-day geomeans, and some have 6 and 6-week geomeans, and but I was kind of hoping to hear a little bit of that from people today, if that's something that is a priority for any of the stakeholders here, to realign all our bacteria TMDLs. I mean, it would be a lot. Things would be simpler if they all were exactly the same. In terms of the strategy as we go forward, I'm probably really leaning on the momentum I think that I saw build at the bacteria summit, because we're asking if we're going to do something really different, not just apply the objective that exists, but something really different. I think we need to have state board and this regional board, maybe other regional boards, also the environmental advocacy groups, plus a lot of stakeholders, MS4 permittees and other permittees. We've all got to be working together, because if we have even one of those groups completely on the outside, something new and different wouldn't succeed. So I'm hoping, in terms of the phases and the strategy, I'm hoping that's something that'll build out of the follow on to the State Board's Bacteria Summit.
That sounds great. And obviously the conversation, right? When I said all stakeholders, I did mean everyone concerned, involved, regulators, regulated communities, but also the advocacy groups, everybody to kind of agree on what makes sense, right? In the challenging situation that we all found ourselves in. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, next one, go to Chris. Chris, can you unmute yourself? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I was wondering if I could share a few slides. I think some of what we're talking about, there's a lot of numbers involved, and so it can be a little bit hard to explain everything in words. Is it possible for me to share some slides?
I don't see why not. Can he share slides, Kenny?
Yeah.
Kenny's in charge of the technical aspect of these things. But don't take too much time, because we got a lot of people here.
Yeah.
Could you hold on a second?
And if you want to come back to me while we figure out how to share slides, I'm okay with that too.
Oh, could you hold on a second? Let me try to figure it out.
Okay, I'll go ahead and mute myself and just circle back when you guys are ready.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hi, Richard. Richard Watson.
Hi, can you can you hear
Yes,
me?
we can
okay?
hear you. Thank you.
I don't see the normal controls. I had a question for LB, I guess in a general one. I'll have some others too. But since the state board in 2019 or 2018, I mean 19, when they did the bacteria provisions, did allow for a reference system or reference system anti-denic approach. And then at the summit, you indicated that without the single sample maximum, it couldn't be done. Do you have any idea how they thought it could be done? Were they thinking of the STV, or how did they think it could be used?
I don't think they had. I don't think they had a specific idea of how it could be done.
You know, is that something that we could collectively talk with them about and see if we could get some ideas? Because as you indicated earlier, that was one of our major concerns, and it appears to be a major concern of everybody, that has been eliminated, and maybe there's a different way of tweaking it somehow.
Yeah, and we're reaching for. We're not too afraid to be creative on our own, but something where we did a reference, some kind of reference approach that involved the geomean, something creative with the geomean. We definitely would want state board on board as we did it. And like I was saying before, probably the bulk of the stakeholders. So yes, I guess my answer is yes. I think that is something we can pursue with.
Well, I had a second question I was curious about, and this relates to the bacteria TMDL for the Los Cerritos channel. There's a high flow suspension allowed in there if we demonstrate over the same period of time that we've met the Enterococcus standards in the saline portion of the channel at half mile downstream of fresh water. But it says we have to demonstrate we've done it over the same period of time. And if we have to demonstrate it with STV, which takes, I guess, a month's worth of weekly samples, how do we do that? Do we just use one sample to demonstrate? If we're talking about a 24-hour period of demonstrating compliance there so we can get the high flow suspension, I haven't figured out how to do it using the STV.
Yeah, I think when Kenny can jump in here too, but I think when we were writing, we were thinking if you have your high flow suspension, you're not necessarily meeting in the high flow suspension reach, but you do meet your geomean downstream, and the geomean would be incorporating, if you happen to be sampling on any of those wet weather days, we'd be incorporating that data.
That's why I was curious about it, because basically it says that during the storm and 24 hours thereafter, and that doesn't seem that matches a 5 or 6 period.
I think Kenny and I are going to have to look at that exact language again, and then answer you specifically on this specific question a little bit later.
Okay,
I should look at the language.
I've got one more quick question for you right now. At the time of the hearing, we noted that we've got very low dry weather sampling or dry weather flows. In fact, our consultants went, I think it was 3 different times in August and September where there was no flow at all. We found some evidence of water, some little puddles, but no flow. And at the time, I argued that maybe we should have a seasonal suspension, and it was the response I think from staff was there was enough water for recreation, and if it's between a 1/4 of an inch and a 1/2 an inch or less, it didn't seem like that was quite enough water for body contact recreation. And I was wondering whether the problem was the need to do use attainability analysis, which is required by the state. And was that one of the reasons you didn't want to go that route?
Yeah, I think we would. I think we would need a use attainability analysis to say, yeah, we don't need to meet this beneficial use.
Well, and it's usually been easier for you to do a use attainability analysis than for someone else to do it and get it approved.
Yes, and that's a question too. I'd like to know if a use attainability analysis because yours is not the only place that has no water or very low water for stretches of the year. And many of those reaches are, water contact recreation beneficial use. So, is that a priority for people? Should we look at doing a UAA kind of the same way we did for high flow suspension? Like during high flow, we suspend the recreational use. Should we do something like that for the low flows too? Is that something that would be valuable to a lot of people?
I would say yes, and we can find out if other people agree.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I'll put on my list of potential priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. The next one go to Luke Ginger. Can you turn on your video, your microphone? Oh, it's gone. Okay, Chris. Chris, can
Okay.
you?
Yeah.
Can you share right now your?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you for figuring out the technology after 2.5 years. I still struggle with it. So I have some slides. I will try to kind of just run through them just to be respectful of time. So let me see if I can host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yes.
You should be a panelist. I see you on the panelist list.
Yeah. Okay. See, I'm struggling with technology. I think you have to enable screen sharing for participants.
Hold on. Okay, how about right now?
Okay. 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 So I just was thinking through these thoughts, and I just figured if I tried to say them, they might not make a lot of sense. So I made some slides. And so one thing I just wanted to point out was that as we look at transitioning from the single sample maximum to STV, just the nature of the objectives changes the likelihood of a violation. So just kind of using some of the examples from the TMDL attachment in response to comments, if we had 3 months of sampling with 5 above the STV, or 1 month of sampling with 4 above the STV. Oh, I lost the slide. Oh, there we go. There you go. The potential violations. This is without allowable exceedance stage, right? With the single sample maximum, you'd have 5. With the STV, you'd have 3. Or in this scenario, you'd have 4 or 1. So kind of inherently, we have this change in violations, and it's not considered less protective, right? The single sample maximum and the STV objectives were considered equally protective when they were adopted. The other thing I wanted to point out is the way that the STV is incorporated as monthly, that 10% exceedance frequency doesn't inherently provide allowable exceedances. So if you're doing weekly sampling every month, and you have 1 sample that's above the STV threshold, it's an exceedance. That month exceeds the STV. So I think we need to separate a little bit the way the objectives are written from this concept of allowable exceedance days. I did want to point out, in the response to comments attachments, the way it was done led to, I think, a higher number, almost overestimation due to how the units were calculated. So I just wanted to point this out and then outline an alternative approach. So historically, we've used wet weeks, but now the STV is applied as months. So we have this situation where we have months times weeks to months. So this unit consistency results in an overestimation, or at least the way we calculated an overestimation. So if we do months, 30% exceedance times the number of wet months, there's 6 wet months in the year, then we end up with lower estimations of allowable exceedances. And if you can, this is a lot to look at, but just wanted to point out a couple. So in dry weather at the beaches, it was 7 versus this other approach is 2, and then winter 7 versus 2. So all but 1 come down, and some come down significantly if you match up the units. But I actually want to suggest, this alternative approach that's we think is more consistent with the STV and the TMDL. And that's where you just pool all the data, right? So instead of separating wet weather or season, you just pool all the data. And what you see is, again, fewer allowable exceedance months. So this would be an alternative approach to calculating it that we think is a bit more appropriate, because when we when we bin the data, we end up in a situation where we're moving away from what the STV is telling us and what the TMDL is telling us. The STV doesn't care about weather. It doesn't care about season. It just says, what were your samples in a month? And that's the same approach that the TMDL took. When you guys applied the new STV and geomean, you moved away from the season and weather approach would make sense because all that data gets considered together. So I think as we look forward for, how can we apply this approach to the STV, we want to bin the data from our reference sites. And I will mention the reference data for the beaches is all up to date because that data has been continuously collected for 20 years. The freshwater is a little bit older. But you can see whether you make the units consistent or take this alternative where you bin all the data, then there are fewer allowable exceedance months than what were presented in the attachment. And then I do want to just point out, just to make this point, right? Like, kind of no matter how we do it, we see that the reference sites exceed the STV. And that kind of fundamentally gets back to, I think the issue that Renee was trying to address back in the early 2000s, that's 20 years ago now, over 20 years ago now, which is that, the LA board came up with this idea that we don't want to treat natural sources, and how do we address that? And so that's where the reference system anti-degradation approach came. But moving away from that, we're also moving away from that stated intent of avoiding treatment of natural sources. So, I'm not speaking for a client, I'm speaking for myself. I think retaining that reference system approach is really important so that we can maintain that intent. And I think whether you do consistent unit calculations or bin the data for more consistency with the STV and the TMDL, I think you can meet that intent. And then I just added this last bullet. I think one thing we have to remember is that we have a really good MS4 permit that said, kind of regardless of your TMDL situation, you should address, problems in your watershed. And because of that, I think all the WIMPs address bacteria. So Los Cerritos Channel didn't have a TMDL, but its WIMP addressed bacteria. Dominguez Channel didn't have a bacteria TMDL, but it addresses bacteria. And I think there's probably one or two other smaller watersheds that might not have a bacteria TMDL, but my understanding is all of these WIMPs address bacteria. And so I think that helps give us some comfort that projects and plans are moving forward to deal with bacteria. And so we have some time to work through this. We can continue the discussion and have a decision and know that through the receiving water limitations and the WIMPs, we have an enforcement mechanism and we have a plan for moving forward. So thanks for letting me show the slides and not having to try to explain those tables.
Yeah, that's great. Can you send me your slides too? Because I want to mull on them and chew on them a little bit.
Okay, sure thing.
What most attracts me to your approach is the fact that it separates wet from dry. And since those are so different, that's a useful, that makes that approach useful in a way. So I'd like to take a look at it. Thank you.
Okay, next one, Luke. Please turn on unmute yourself. Luke, can you hear me?
Oh, it looks like Luke took his hand down.
Okay. Rich Watson, do you want to talk, or because you still raise your hand?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I had one other question that came to me, and I may not understand the context exactly. But in the state objective or state what provisions on page 4 under water quality standards assessment, it mentions a situation specific weight of evidence factor. And it says, unless a situation weight of evidence factor is being applied, only the geometric mean value should be applied based on the statistical number, et cetera. And then says, however, there's not enough, then you can use the STV. What is meant there by situation specific weight of evidence factor?
That's the language for, in case there's something we never thought of, but it's real. And regional, this is talking about assessment, right? So this is talking about listing decisions, putting something, a water body or a beach on the 303D list or taking it off. So, and I think that, you know, the water body specific evidence provision that you see with some of the assessments is, it's really just sort of the catch-all. What if you have a situation that we have not anticipated and you can make a case that something should be listed or not listed because of that?
Do you ever use that situation specific weight of evidence factor in any other situation other than listing or delisting?
No, that's specifically about that language is specifically about listing and delisting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I think the one I can't think of an example of when we've used a site-specific weight of evidence kind of approach with a listing or delisting, unless the only example I think was maybe if somebody demonstrated there was a trend with some pollutant or bacteria and saying, you know, we need to list this because it's just getting worse and we believe it'll continue to get worse, kind of thing. But
could work the other way.
I can't think of a good example though.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Max, unmute yourself. You can.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You know, I really liked Chris Minton's comment about sort of the reference condition anti-deg approach and not having to treat or address any exceedances above and beyond the reference site condition. LB, I don't know if you can remember this far back, but I actually was the chair of the Santa Monica Bay Bacterial TMDL, Santa Monica Bay Bacterial TMDL, and Renee was a member and representing the regional board. And I was also a commissioner with SCORP when we were discussing the reference site approach. And I always liked the concept or the logic behind the reference condition approach, because you know, essentially the concept is if there were no humans on the face of the earth, how much bacteria would be going to that beach, and what kind of what levels of our numbers of exceedances would be at that beach. And then you introduce the humans there, and then you have a number of exceedances, and we would need to address and mitigate the exceedances down to the reference level. In other words, the part that we contributed, we have to take care of. Yeah. That always made sense to me. To me, it's like the nutrient issue. You know, you have fertilizers coming down from stormwater. So the MS4 permit needs to address that. The POTWs discharge nutrients with their effluent, and so we need to address that. But the upwelling amount of nutrients, we're not responsible for that. That's a natural input. And you know, getting back to the concept of the reference condition or the reference approach, I still think the logic is behind it, and I like that approach. Yeah.
You know, you were there in the beginning. What was the thinking in the beginning when the reference system approach was being developed about the geomean? Was there like just an assumption that, well, we'll still apply the geomean, but you know, once we get down to the requisite number of exceedance days, we'll probably meet the geomean? Or what was the thinking then about the?
That's a great question. Albeit, unfortunately, as I think Chris mentioned, that was over 20 years ago.
20 years ago, yeah.
I can't remember that far back. I just have I think that the concept or the conversation about that was that, you know, an exceedance of single samples was like the immediate health concern, whereas the geo-mean addressed kind of the persistence of the contamination.
Yeah.
And so if it persisted above a certain number or something, it is certainly something that we needed to address, because it meant that it was kind of a long-term input.
Yeah.
I think that was the concept. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, okay. That's all the comment I had.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next one, Chris Ginger, sorry, Luke Ginger.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
we can.
All right, thank you.
Sorry
Yeah,
for-
sorry, I was trying before. I needed someone to allow me to speak. So, yeah, I guess my comment would be about the California Bacteria Summit last week. I guess I just wanted to give a disclaimer about that. You know, that was basically a summit hosted by CASCA, and there wasn't any. There were some academics there, but the nonprofit community wasn't there.
That's
Justice community wasn't there. Native indigenous groups were not there either. It was a very one-sided bacteria summit. I just want to give you all a warning about that before you read too much into it. And you know, there's been a lot of discussion about QMRA here, and I think there was, you know, one thing I noticed about the bacteria summit that was lacking was just based off the agenda. I didn't attend. There's a need to get on the same page when it comes to QMRA, because I've seen improper implementation of QMRA, particularly down in San Diego. So, you know, you can't rely on QMRA unless you can get your human sources down to 0. You know, that's what QMRA says. So it's not going to be everyone's saving grace, especially in like urban areas. So I kind of just wanted to get that message across. And also, you know, the recent research is showing that there's an interaction between different sources of fecal bacteria. So if you have avian bacteria in the water, that actually changes the health risk of the human bacteria you have in there. So that just further illustrates the need to get human sources down to 0. So I just wanted to get those messages across.
Yeah, thank you. You know, and you're absolutely right about the bacteria summit. I don't think there were any environmental advocate groups there. Certainly weren't tribes or any of the nonprofits. And people talked about that. You know, it's like we have these great ideas. None of them are going to work unless those stakeholders of the tribes are also part of it. You know, and that's kind of the point I was making when I was talking about even during my presentation, is we would need all the stakeholders on board to do something that's really, you know, creative and different or innovative, that it's not just applying the standard, which exists. It's the objective. So you're absolutely right about the other parties that need to be involved. So thank you.
Okay, Chris, you raised your hand again. Do you want to say something?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that EPA's 2012 criteria does not say that QMRA can only be done where there's 0 human. It actually denotes predominantly non-human, which is not 0 human. Just wanted to clarify that on QMRA.
Yeah, I think we have QMRA questions we'd have to answer. Quite a few QMRA questions we'd have to answer if we want to use it for a site-specific objective.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, it should be a big, comprehensive, inclusive process for sure.
Yeah. You know, if we don't have the hands up, we can. Oh, here's another hand.
Oh,
let's hear from Chris.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, LB. That was a really helpful presentation. I just wanted to kind of tack on to the question about controlling dry weather flows, and the question about how geomean was anticipated to be controlled. And I can't speak from the perspective of being there when that TMDL was developed, but I know for our RAAs, and I'm speaking specifically on the Santa Monica Bay side, the groups along Santa Monica Bay, as we all know, have invested so much time and effort in eliminating non-stormwater dry weather discharges. So there was an assumption kind of baked into the RAA that if we eliminate those dry weather contributions, even in a 90th percentile condition, I can't remember off the top of my head, but we're talking about 40 something wet weather days. And so to eliminate our dry weather contributions would really take care of the geomean exceedances. I think that can be shown, via simple data analysis, as we've done. But what I will say, the other assumption in there that I think is, and I'm just throwing this out there as an important consideration moving forward, and a bridge I think will need to be crossed, unless it has been, and I'm just unaware. But the reality that, if we've eliminated all our non-stormwater discharges, all our dry weather discharges, I should say, and yet the geomean calculation is based on data in the receiving water, how do we take into account the fact that we are literally not discharging when a measurement happens during dry weather? And we all know that some dry weather exceedances, are still measured in the wave wash according to our sampling data. And so, how do we account for that in our geomean calculations? I think is an important consideration moving forward and into the future when these things become effective. So, yeah. And this gets to the point that I think has been shared about, controlling what we can control, right? And that burden appropriately being placed on MS4 agencies, whereas not placing an unnecessary burden on them or an uncontrollable burden of, well, hey, there's stuff we can't control. And I think the fact of showing that there's even single sample exceedances during dry weather when we have no discharges is a helpful point to consider in that fact. So just a couple things there I wanted to kind of throw into the ring and add. So
okay, thank you.
I don't see. Oh, okay. Here we go. John?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is John Ball. I'm with City of Los Angeles, LA Sanitation Watershed Protection Division. And I just want to say thank you for holding this workshop. And it was good for me to hear, just the history on how the progression of how the standards were applied in the TMDLs. And just I can kind of appreciate the struggle in dealing with this reference beach approach using these new water quality standards. So the Los Cerritos channel being the first time this has kind of been put to the test in that regard. I think one thing I gathered from today is that the reference beach approach, anti-degradation approach, still could be applied in TMDLs with these new standards. It might take some tweaking, it sounds like. But I think our perspective is we would like to kind of keep the door open on that. And that would apply to some future TMDLs. I know you guys are working on Dominguez Channel. And it would hope we could kind of at least consider some options on the reference beach approach. And then of course, our concern is also that if it does change kind of the existing TMDLs, it does impact how we approach our modeling for our watershed management plans. And I mean, I think we can probably expect to have to redo that that modeling on some level, and we've done that before. But I guess just knowing that there could be cost implications from whatever method is chosen with respect to the reference speech approach. So those are our concerns. I guess the take home is I hope we can keep this dialogue going and not necessarily close the door on the reference speech approach. So
yeah, I think I hear my responses. I hear all the things you're saying. Those are certainly legitimate concerns. I think that if we embraced some kind of new reference speech approach, reference water body approach, it'd be more than a tweak. A tweak is like if you recalculate your data and now there's 2 exceedance days allowed or 4 exceedance days allowed instead of 3. Applying a reference speech approach to something like a geomean or SDV, that's a big thing. Yeah, it's more than a tweak. But we're definitely still, open to figuring out answers like that.
yeah, thank you. I'm wondering, Chris Minton, if you're still on the call, maybe you could share that presentation with us as well on the kind of your alternative analysis. I wasn't sure I quite digested that completely, but that would be interesting.
If you want to, Chris, you can send it to us, and then I think because we'll have a list of the emails, right? Because everybody had to register with an email, so we could send it out if anybody, if Chris wanted to share it that way.
It should be in your inbox.
Oh, okay, all right. We'll send it out to the participants of this workshop, the Chris Minton alternative.
And I did appreciate the mention of acknowledging the risk, how the risk to swimmers and recreators, that illness rate. That's I'm still trying to kind of grasp how that turns into implementation and objectives, but I think that was one thing that I really realized from the summit was that's what we're really after is this, well, it's improved health for our people
and also
recreating in the waters.
If we do something innovative, new, creative, I think that's the main thing that we would have to demonstrate, that we are as protective as not more than 32 additional illnesses per 1,000 recreators, at least that as protective as that standard.
Yeah.
Anticipated when we were looking at doing QMRAs, that's what we were looking at. Can we demonstrate that we're at least that protective? Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Anyone want to speak at this moment?
I'll wrap up if we have nobody else that wants to speak. Just to say thank you, everybody, for coming. Kenny and I are definitely available for, we don't have to meet just in big official workshops. We can talk anytime with any of you guys. So I really appreciate you coming today, and thank you. I think somebody just asked if we'll share our slides, and we'll share our slides and Chris's slides with all the emails that registered. Thank you, guys. All right, I guess we're wrapped up. Thanks, Kenny.
Okay. So we will stop our workshop today.
Yep.
And if you have any question, you can contact us by phone or by email. And
so thank you for showing that again, Kenny. Thanks.
Okay, see you next time.